Stop pretending this is your family. My daughter-in-law laughed at dinner. I didn't answer. I set my fork down, folded my napkin once, and pushed my chair back from the table. The sound it made against the hardwood floor felt louder than it should have. No one said my name. No one told her to stop. My son stared at his plate as if it held something urgent and important. I walked out of the dining room without another word. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and let me know where you're watching from. I didn't know then how far this story would reach or how much it would change the way I saw the word family. The dining room looked the same as it always had. The long oak table my husband refinished 30 years ago still shone under the overhead light. The chairs were set just the way I liked them, evenly spaced, the place settings neat. I had cooked pot roast that afternoon, slow and careful, letting it simmer for hours the way my husband loved. Mashed potatoes, green beans, warm rolls wrapped in a clean towel. I had tasted everything twice, adjusting the salt, wanting it to be right. I was 72 years old, and I still believed effort mattered. My husband had been gone just under a year. Some days, the house still felt full of him. Other days, like this one, it felt like a stage set where everyone knew their lines except me. I had invited my son and his wife for dinner because that's what I had always done. Sunday dinners. A habit that survived school years, college, marriage, or so I thought. When she laughed, it wasn't loud. It was light, almost playful, as if she were correcting a child who didn't understand a simple rule. Stop pretending. The word stuck with me. Pretending meant I had imagined everything. The years, the sacrifices, the way this family had been built around my kitchen table. I stood in the hallway for a moment after leaving the room. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, just as it always had. I could hear them still sitting there. The clink of silverware, a chair shifting, my son clearing his throat, life continuing without me. I went into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I looked at the pot still warm on the stove, the rolls untouched in their basket. I thought about how many times I had cooked this same meal. Birthdays, anniversaries, even the night after my husband's funeral, when no one was very hungry, but everyone ate anyway. I didn't cry. I rinsed my hands at the sink and dried them on a towel. I could hear her voice drifting in from the dining room now, casual and confident, filling the space the way she always did. My son murmured something back. I couldn't make out the words, and I didn't try. After a minute, I picked up my purse from the chair by the door. I slipped my keys into my hand. The house smelled like dinner and furniture polish and something old and familiar, something that suddenly felt temporary. As I stepped outside, the evening air was cool. The porch light cast a soft circle on the walkway. I stood there for a second, listening to the door close behind me. It didn't slam. It never did. I drove around the block before pulling over. The steering wheel felt smooth under my palms. I sat there, engine running, and watched the houses along the street. Lights on, curtains drawn, families inside doing whatever families do. That was the moment I understood something important. Not everything that is taken from you is done loudly. Some things are erased quietly, with a laugh, while everyone else looks away. And that was only the beginning. The house felt different after the funeral. Not louder, not quieter, just hollow. The morning light still came through the kitchen window at the same angle it always had, landing on the counter where my husband used to sit with his coffee. His mug was still there in the cabinet. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't needed to. No one asked me why it stayed. In the weeks after he passed, I learned how quickly routines disappear when you're no longer considered part of them. My son stopped asking what time I'd be home. Not that he ever said it out loud. He simply assumed. His wife began making plans without mentioning them to me. Appointments, dinners, weekends away. I would hear about them afterward, usually in passing, usually as if I were a neighbor instead of his mother. I noticed small things first. My groceries were moved to one side of the refrigerator. A new calendar appeared on the wall, filled in with handwriting that wasn't mine. My name wasn't on it. Not once. After the dinner where she laughed, I stayed in my bedroom more. Not because I was afraid of her, because the rest of the house no longer felt like it belonged to me. The hallway seemed narrower, the living room quieter in a way that made it hard to breathe. Every chair felt like it had been claimed. One afternoon, I folded laundry and realized my dresser drawer had been rearranged. Not emptied, just shifted. My things stacked tighter, as if preparing for something. I stood there for a long time, holding a sweater I had owned longer than their marriage, wondering when it stopped being my home and started being a place I was tolerated. My son avoided eye contact more now. When I spoke, he nodded. When I asked questions, he answered them quickly, as if moving past them mattered more than answering them well. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Silence did the work for him. At night, I lay awake listening to the house. Doors opening, laughter drifting from the living room. The television turned down when I walked past. I wasn't excluded openly. That would have been easier. I was phased out, piece by piece. I thought about my husband often during those hours. About how he used to say, "As long as you're here, this house is home." He said it casually, like a fact that didn't need defending. I realized then how much of my place in this family had been protected by his presence. Without him, I was exposed. No one told me to leave. Not yet. They didn't need to. Everything around me suggested it. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Decisions were made elsewhere. I became someone who needed to be informed, not included. One evening, I made myself soup and ate alone at the kitchen table. The chair across from me stayed empty. I didn't fill it with memory. I just noticed it. When I finished, I washed the bowl and dried it carefully, the way I always had. Old habits die slowly, even when they're no longer welcome. I began to understand something then. Grief doesn't always come from loss alone. Sometimes it comes from being quietly removed from a life you helped build, while everyone insists nothing has changed. That realization sat with me, steady and cold, and it made me pay attention. The changes became harder to ignore once I started paying attention. It wasn't just the big moments anymore. It was the small, ordinary things that told the truth. The way my son spoke to me now, carefully neutral, as if every word were chosen to avoid responsibility. The way his wife spoke for him, answering questions I had directed at him, deciding things before I could finish a sentence. One morning, I opened the hall closet and found my coats pushed to the back. Her jackets hung in front, bright and new, taking up most of the space. I stood there longer than necessary, running my hand along the sleeve of an old wool coat I'd worn through winters long before she entered our lives. It smelled faintly of cedar. It smelled like mine. At breakfast, they talked about renovations, not in detail, just enough for me to hear words like open space and storage and clearing things out. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if I wanted anything kept the same. I wasn't part of the conversation. I was the background it happened against. Later that week, I noticed my mail had been stacked separately. Bills and letters placed neatly on the corner of the counter, away from theirs. It felt intentional. Organized. Like a boundary being drawn without discussion. I picked up an envelope addressed to me and realized it had been opened already. My son apologized quickly. Said he thought it was his. He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. I began to see patterns. When I entered a room, conversations shifted. When I sat down, phones appeared. My presence no longer added anything. It interrupted. I remembered a time when my son used to call me from work just to ask what I was cooking for dinner. Now, he barely asked if I'd eaten. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone in the living room. She didn't know I was home. Her voice was low, confident. I caught fragments. We'll handle it soon. She doesn't need all that space. It's better this way. She laughed softly, the same laugh from the dinner table, and my stomach tightened. I went back to my room and closed the door. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how easily people rewrite history when it suits them. How quickly years of care become invisible. I had raised my son to be kind. I had taught him to stand up for others. Somewhere along the way, that lesson had stopped applying to me. The next day, I found one of my photo albums moved from the living room shelf. It was still in the house, just relocated to a lower cabinet, half hidden behind board games I didn't recognize. I opened it anyway. Pictures of birthdays, holidays, my husband smiling beside me, his hand always finding mine, proof of a life that once mattered. At dinner that evening, she corrected me when I spoke. Not sharply, casually, as if adjusting a fact, not a person. My son stayed quiet. He always did. Silence had become his default response, and it felt heavier than any argument. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I listened. I watched. I started keeping track of what was said and what wasn't, of what was moved, of what was decided without me. Because by then I understood something clearly. They weren't just pushing me aside. They were preparing for a version of the future where I no longer existed in it. That night, I dreamed of my husband. Not the version from the hospital, thin and quiet, wires and machines surrounding him. I dreamed of the man who used to come home with sawdust on his sleeves, who whistled while fixing loose hinges, who believed a house was only as strong as the people it protected. When I woke up, the bed beside me was cold. It always was now. I sat there longer than usual, my feet on the floor, listening to the house settle, the sound of pipes, a door opening down the hall, her footsteps, confident and unhurried. I found one of my husband's old notebooks later that morning. It was tucked into a drawer in the study, the one he used to call his thinking room. Inside were notes about repairs, dates, small reminders written in his careful handwriting, measurements, costs, plans. On the last page, he had written a sentence and underlined it twice. Make sure she's always taken care of. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest for a moment. He had said it often when he was alive, said it as if it were obvious, as if it didn't need witnesses. I remembered the years clearly, working extra shifts when money was tight, stretching meals, putting my own needs last so my son could have what he needed. College tuition, wedding expenses, down payments quietly covered without discussion. I never kept score. Families weren't supposed to. Somewhere along the way, my role had shifted. I went from being the foundation to being an inconvenience, from someone consulted to someone tolerated. The change didn't happen all at once. It happened in smiles that didn't reach the eyes, in decisions announced, not discussed, in the way my name stopped being used in sentences that involved the future. That afternoon, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and watched dust move through a shaft of sunlight. The furniture was familiar. The walls held photos I had chosen and framed, and yet I felt like a guest, a long-term guest maybe, but still temporary. My son came in and asked if I needed anything from the store. His voice was polite, distant. I shook my head and thanked him. He nodded and left the room. The exchange felt complete to him. It didn't to me. I thought about all the times my husband had stepped in without raising his voice, the way he used to place a hand on my shoulder during tense moments, the way that small gesture had been enough to remind everyone where I stood. Without him, there was no interruption, no correction. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't just about her, or even about my son. It was about the absence of protection. In the evening, I opened a small box I kept in my closet. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years. Deeds, statements, old letters, things my husband insisted we keep organized. I didn't spread them out. I didn't analyze them yet. I simply confirmed they were there. I put the box back and closed the door. At dinner, she talked about plans again, rearranging, simplifying, making things easier. She smiled when she said it. My son nodded. I ate quietly, listening more than chewing. They thought I was retreating. What they didn't understand was that I was remembering, not just the past, but what had been promised, what had been built, what was never meant to be taken lightly. I finished my meal, cleared my plate, and thanked her for dinner. She looked surprised. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. The next few days settled into a strange rhythm. Nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices, no open arguments. And yet, everything felt heavier, like the air itself had shifted. I moved through the house carefully, not because I was afraid, but because I was suddenly aware of how closely I was being observed. She watched me now. Not openly, in passing, from doorways, from across the room. Her questions sounded polite, but they carried an edge. What time would I be home? Whether I planned to go out, if I needed help with anything. Each question felt less like concern and more like inventory. My son remained distant, present but absent. He spoke when spoken to. He smiled when appropriate, but he never lingered. He never asked how I was sleeping, or whether I missed his father. He behaved like someone waiting for a process to finish. One afternoon, I returned from a short walk and noticed my bedroom door slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first. The bed was made, the curtains were the same, but the drawer where I kept personal papers was not aligned the way I left it. Subtle, almost unnoticeable. I didn't check it right away. I sat on the edge of the bed instead and looked around. At the photos on the dresser. At the mirror that reflected a woman older than I felt, but more awake than I had been in months. That night, I checked the drawer. Everything was still there, just handled, touched. I understood then that privacy was no longer guaranteed. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because they believed they had the right. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me clear. The following morning, I received a phone call from someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. A friend of my husband's. We exchanged polite words, spoke about the weather, about time passing too quickly. Before hanging up, he paused and said, almost casually, "Your husband was always very precise about things. He liked to plan." I agreed. I always had. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee slowly. The chair across from me was empty, but I no longer filled it with longing. I filled it with memory, with facts, with the understanding that my husband had not been careless. He had known people changed. He had known silence could be dangerous. Later that day, she mentioned something about downsizing, about how a smaller place might be less overwhelming for me. She said it gently, with a smile. I nodded. I didn't disagree. I didn't agree either. I let the moment pass. Inside, something settled. That evening, I took out the small box again. This time, I opened it fully. I read through the document slowly. I didn't rush. There was no need. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Names, dates, signatures, intentions made clear long before anyone laughed at a dinner table. I closed the box and returned it to its place. At dinner, she talked about her plans. My son listened. I listened too. Not to the words, but to the confidence behind them. The assumption. The certainty that the future had already been decided. They believed that because I was quiet, I was unaware. Because I was polite, I was weak. Because I didn't confront them, I didn't understand. They were wrong. I finished my meal and excused myself early. In my room, I sat by the window and watched the lights come on along the street. Each house holding its own version of truth, its own quiet negotiations. I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt prepared. And for the first time since my husband passed, I slept through the night without waking. The shift happened quietly, the way most important things do. It began with a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I was in the laundry room folding towels when their voices carried down the hall. They were standing in the kitchen, close enough that I could hear the rhythm of their words, even when I couldn't catch every sentence. "She doesn't need all that space anymore," she said. My son didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Careful. We'll figure it out." Figure it out. As if my life were a problem to solve. I didn't step out. I didn't interrupt. I finished folding the towels, stacked them neatly, and placed them where they belonged. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. I had crossed some invisible line where shock no longer lived. Later that afternoon, she asked if I had any appointments coming up. Her tone was pleasant. Curious. I told her no. She nodded, satisfied, as if confirming a detail on a checklist. When she turned away, I caught a glimpse of her expression in the hallway mirror. Focused. Determined. That was when I understood this wasn't about concern. It was about timing. I began noticing patterns in what they discussed when they thought I wasn't listening. Words like transition and next steps. Phrases about what was best for everyone. Always vague. Always reasonable on the surface. Never asking what I wanted. One evening, I overheard her mention a real estate agent on the phone. She lowered her voice when she said the address. My address. She laughed softly as if sharing good news. I stood in the doorway of my room and waited until the call ended before stepping back into the hall. At dinner, I said nothing. I passed the bread. I listened. My son avoided my eyes again, just as he always did. He was complicit in his quiet way, not cruel, just absent. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a notebook. I hadn't kept one in years. I wrote down dates, small observations, things I had overheard, things that had been moved or mentioned, not out of fear, out of clarity. I wasn't documenting betrayal. I was organizing information. The next morning, I drove to the bank. I hadn't planned to. I didn't rush. I dressed the same way I always did. Drove the same roads. Parked in the same spot. The teller greeted me by name. She always had. I asked a few simple questions, confirmed a few details. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. As I sat there listening, something inside me settled completely. This was the moment I stopped reacting and started deciding. When I returned home, the house was quiet. I walked through each room slowly, not with nostalgia, with assessment. I noticed which spaces still felt like mine and which had already been claimed. The difference was clear. She came home later and mentioned an appointment she had made for all of us. She didn't specify when or where. She smiled when she said it. I smiled back. The exchange ended there. That evening, I called my husband's old friend back, the one who mentioned planning. We spoke briefly. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He simply reminded me of something my husband used to say. Never explain when the paperwork speaks for itself. I slept well that night, because by then, I knew exactly what was happening, and more importantly, I knew what they didn't. The first person to say it out loud wasn't a lawyer. It was a neighbor. She stopped me one morning as I was bringing the trash bins back up the driveway. We had lived next to each other for over 20 years, long enough to exchange pleasantries, long enough to notice changes without commenting on them. She hesitated before speaking, her hand still resting on the handle of her screen door. "I hope this isn't out of line," she said, "but I've noticed a lot of conversations happening lately about the house." I thanked her for telling me. She didn't press. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and went back inside. That was enough. Later that day, I received another call, this time from someone who had known my husband longer than I had, a man who had helped him with paperwork years ago. We spoke briefly, carefully. He didn't offer opinions. He offered facts, reminded me of dates, of decisions that had been made quietly, deliberately. "You were always included," he said. That was very important to him. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around. The same table where she had laughed, where my son had looked away. The same surface that had held birthday cakes, school projects, and condolence cards after the funeral. I understood then that I wasn't as alone as they believed. That evening, my son came home earlier than usual. He asked how my day had been. The question sounded rehearsed. I answered politely. He nodded. He hesitated, then said his wife had scheduled a meeting for the following week. Something about options, something about planning ahead. I told him I'd consider it. He looked relieved. That told me everything. Over the next few days, small confirmations appeared. A comment from a family friend, a casual remark from someone at church, pieces aligning quietly, forming a picture that had always existed. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't acknowledge what I knew. I simply adjusted. I began spending more time outside the house, not to escape, but to create space. Space to think, space to observe. When I returned, things felt different. They watched me more closely now, as if they sensed a shift they couldn't name. One afternoon, I overheard her telling someone on the phone that everything was under control. She said it confidently, casually. I stood in the hallway, out of sight, and listened until the call ended. That word stayed with me. Control. That night, I opened the notebook again and added a few more lines. Names, dates, conversations. Nothing emotional, just information. I realized I wasn't collecting evidence. I was restoring balance. A few days later, I met with someone quietly. We talked about the past, not the present, about arrangements that had been made long before anyone laughed at me. I asked questions. I received clear answers. I left without drama. When I came home, she asked where I'd been. I told her I'd run errands. She smiled. Too quickly. My son said nothing. At dinner, she talked about timelines again, about how everyone would be more comfortable once things were settled. I listened. I finished my meal. I excused myself. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Support. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. Real. They believed I was isolated because I was quiet. They didn't realize silence had given me room to remember who still stood with me, and who always had. By then, my silence had become part of their routine. They stopped checking whether I agreed. They stopped explaining their plans in full. They spoke around me, not to me, confident that I would continue doing what I had always done, listen, adjust, make things easier for everyone else. I let them believe that. Mornings were the same. I woke early, made my coffee, and sat by the window. I watched cars pass, people leaving for work, lives moving forward. Inside the house, footsteps came and went. Doors opened and closed. Decisions were made without me, and I didn't interrupt. She grew more comfortable. I could tell by the way she spoke now, openly discussing timelines, mentioning names without lowering her voice. She talked about after everything's settled as if it were already done. My son nodded along, offering quiet agreement. He had fully stepped into his role, not as my defender, as her support. I stayed out of their way. I began packing small things, not boxes, just drawers, one at a time. Items I no longer needed to see every day. Old scarves, books I had already read more than once. I didn't label anything. I didn't announce it. The changes were subtle enough to go unnoticed. One afternoon, she commented that I seemed calmer. She said it lightly, almost approvingly. I smiled and told her I was sleeping better. That wasn't a lie. Calm comes easily once uncertainty is replaced with clarity. My son started offering help more often. Did I need a ride? Did I need groceries? His voice carried relief now, as if my cooperation made everything easier. I thanked him each time. I accepted nothing. At dinner, she began testing boundaries. Small comments. Suggestions framed as concern. This place is a lot to manage. Wouldn't it be nice to have fewer responsibilities? I listened. I nodded occasionally. I asked no questions. Inside, I kept track. Every word they used assumed an outcome. Every plan they referenced assumed my absence. They believed I had already agreed, simply because I hadn't resisted. They mistook restraint for surrender. I returned to my notebook each night. Not to write feelings, to write facts, dates, names, confirmations. The notebook stayed hidden, not because it needed to be, but because it belonged to me alone. One evening, I overheard her telling someone that things were finally moving in the right direction. She sounded pleased, accomplished. I passed through the hallway without acknowledging the comment. My steps were steady, my back straight. They were counting on me to react emotionally, to argue, to plead, to demand explanations. When I did none of those things, they relaxed. They believed the hardest part was over. They were wrong, because the quiet version of me was not confused. She was deliberate. I stopped explaining myself entirely. When asked questions, I answered simply. When presented with ideas, I said I would think about it. My answers offered no resistance, but no permission either. The house felt different now. Not hollow, controlled. I moved through it knowing exactly what I was doing and why. I noticed how often she checked her phone, how often my son looked relieved when I stayed silent. They thought I was waiting. I was. Not for them to change their minds. Not for an apology. I was waiting for the moment when they would be most certain they had won. Because certainty makes people careless. And carelessness reveals everything. Her mask started slipping once she believed everything was settled. It showed in small ways at first. In the tone she used when speaking to me, sharper now, less careful. In the way she no longer bothered to soften her words with smiles. The politeness she once performed disappeared, replaced by something closer to impatience. One evening at dinner, she corrected me mid-sentence. Not gently, not quietly. My son glanced up, then back down at his plate. He didn't intervene. He never did. The silence between them felt rehearsed, as if they had already agreed on who I was allowed to be. Later that night, I heard her voice rise in the living room, not yelling, just firm, confident. She was speaking to my son about timelines again, about how things needed to move faster, about how it was dragging on. I caught my name once, spoken casually, like a detail. I stayed in my room and listened until the conversation ended. The next morning, I found a brochure on the kitchen counter. It hadn't been there the night before. Clean, glossy, smiling faces on the cover, words like community and simplified living. It wasn't addressed to me. It didn't need to be. The message was clear. I picked it up, flipped through a few pages, then placed it back exactly where I found it. When she came into the kitchen, she watched my face carefully, waiting for a reaction. I poured my coffee and said nothing. She looked disappointed, then annoyed. That was new. From that point on, she stopped pretending her intentions were about my comfort. She spoke openly about what would be best for the house, what would be easier financially. She talked as if decisions had already been finalized, as if my role in them was optional. My son followed her lead. He began using phrases she used. We think. We've decided. Not once did he say you. Not once did he ask what I wanted. One afternoon, she asked me directly how long I planned to stay. The question was framed lightly, but her eyes were sharp. Measuring. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She sighed, just slightly, as if I were being unreasonable. That sigh told me everything. The more confident she became, the more careless she grew. She discussed private matters within earshot. She assumed I wouldn't act, wouldn't respond, wouldn't remember. She believed her control was complete. At dinner one night, she laughed again. Not at me. About me. About how some people don't know when it's time to let go. My son smiled faintly. I finished my meal without comment. Inside, something shifted. I realized then that her cruelty wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. It came out strongest when she thought she was winning, when she believed there were no consequences left to consider. She had mistaken my restraint for weakness, my patience for permission. I went back to my room and sat at the desk. I opened the notebook and added one final entry, a summary, clear, complete, enough. That night I slept calmly. No tension, no questions. The pattern was obvious now. The truth fully exposed. They thought I had nothing left to stand on. What they didn't realize was that by showing me exactly who they were, she had given me everything I needed. And she did it herself. The decision was made without an announcement. It happened on an ordinary weekday morning. The house was quiet. My son and his wife had already left for work. I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked around, not with sentiment, but with certainty. There was nothing left to consider. I dressed carefully, choosing the same coat I had worn to my husband's memorial service, the one that still felt like armor. I locked the door behind me and drove the familiar route through town. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. The office was calm, neutral, the kind of place where emotions didn't enter the room unless invited. I greeted the receptionist, gave my name, and waited. When I was called in, I sat down and placed my purse on the chair beside me. My hands were steady. I didn't explain my situation. I didn't need to. I asked specific questions. I received specific answers. Dates, documents, confirmations. Everything aligned with what I already knew. When I left, I felt lighter. Not relieved, certain. On the drive home, I stopped at a grocery store and picked up a few items. Nothing special, just what I needed for dinner. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always, quiet, unassuming. It gave nothing away. She was home when I walked in, sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up briefly and nodded, asked where I'd been. I told her I'd run errands. She smiled and returned to her screen. My son came home later. He asked if everything was all right. His voice carried the same careful distance it always did. I told him yes. He looked relieved. That was the moment I knew how deeply he had underestimated me. At dinner, they talked about next steps again, about meetings, about timelines. She spoke with confidence, laying out plans as if they were already approved. My son nodded along. I listened. I ate. I didn't interrupt. When the plates were cleared, I stood and thanked her for the meal. She seemed surprised. My politeness confused her now. She was used to it, meaning compliance. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Not anxiously, just patiently. I could hear them talking in the living room, their voices low, comfortable, certain. They had no idea that the balance of power had already shifted. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no restlessness. The kind of sleep that comes when something important has been resolved. The next morning, I woke early again. I made coffee. I watched the light move across the floor. When my son came into the kitchen, I told him I would be out for part of the day. He nodded, didn't ask why. Before leaving, I returned to my room and opened the notebook one last time. I read through the pages slowly, then I closed it and placed it back in the drawer. It had served its purpose. As I stepped outside, I realized something else. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the need to be understood. What I felt was control, quiet, complete. They were still talking about what they planned to do. I had already done it, and they wouldn't realize that until it was too late. The confrontation didn't happen the way she expected. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic announcement. It happened on a quiet evening, after dinner, when the house had settled into its usual rhythm. The dishes were done. The television murmured softly in the living room. Everything felt normal. That's what made it effective. She was the first to speak. She always was when she felt confident. She mentioned the meeting again, the one she had scheduled for all of us. Her tone was firm now, no smile attached. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if I were simply being informed. My son sat beside her, hands folded, eyes fixed somewhere just past the coffee table. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His silence had already chosen a side. I listened until she finished. Then I said her name. Just once. The room changed. She turned toward me, surprised. Not alarmed. Yet. I told her calmly that I wouldn't be attending any meetings. That I had already taken care of what needed to be done. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain what I meant. My son finally looked up. "What do you mean?" he asked. I met his eyes. For the first time in a long while, I didn't soften my expression to protect him. I told him that some decisions didn't require group discussion, that some arrangements had been made long before he stopped paying attention. She laughed, but the sound was different this time. Short, uncertain. She asked what arrangements I was talking about. Her confidence wavered just slightly. I didn't answer right away. I stood, walked to the hallway, and returned with a single folder. I placed it on the table between them. I didn't slide it forward. I didn't open it. I told them they would be hearing from someone soon, someone they already knew, someone who handled details. I said it simply, without emphasis. My son's face changed first. Confusion, then concern. He reached for the folder, but I placed my hand on it, gently. Firm, I told him it wasn't for him to read yet. Her smile disappeared completely. She asked if this was some kind of threat. I shook my head. I told her it wasn't a threat. It was a conclusion. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. She looked at my son, waiting for him to speak, to defend her, to challenge me. He didn't. He looked trapped between the two of us, unsure of where to stand now that the ground had shifted. I gathered the folder and returned it to my room. Behind me, I heard her voice rise. Questions. Accusations. My son trying to calm her down. I closed my door and sat on the edge of the bed, listening without reacting. They finally understood something then. I wasn't confused, I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't leaving quietly. The power they thought they had was based on an assumption that I would continue to accept whatever they decided for me. That assumption was gone. And they could feel it. The house was quieter after that. Not tense, not heavy, just quiet in a way that finally made sense. She avoided me for the first few days. When we crossed paths, her smile was tight, controlled. She spoke only when necessary. My son moved through the house carefully now, like someone unsure of where the walls were. He no longer assumed. He asked before speaking, before planning, before deciding. Nothing had been shouted. Nothing had been taken back. And yet, everything had changed. A few days later, the call came. Short, professional, confirming what had already been set in motion. I listened, thanked the caller, and ended the conversation. I didn't share the details. I didn't need to. The shift had already happened. At dinner that evening, she was quiet. My son cleared his throat more than once, but said nothing. The meal passed without discussion of plans or timelines. No talk of meetings, no talk of moving. I finished my food and excused myself early. In my room, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights come on. The same street, the same houses, the same view I had seen for decades. What felt different was me. I thought about the night she laughed, the way that moment had burned itself into my memory. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified everything. That laugh had been meant to reduce me, to remind me of my place. Instead, it showed me exactly where I stood and where I didn't. The following week, arrangements were finalized quietly, without drama, without confrontation. No one was humiliated. No one was cast out. The outcome spoke for itself. She stopped suggesting. My son stopped assuming. They both learned something they hadn't expected to learn, that silence is not the same as surrender, and patience is not the same as weakness. On a Sunday morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table alone. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor. The house felt settled, balanced. I wasn't waiting anymore. Later that day, my son came to my door. He hesitated before knocking. When I opened it, he looked older than I remembered. Not tired, just aware. "I didn't see it," he said. His voice was quiet. "I should have." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't comfort him either. Some realizations have to be carried alone. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about my husband, about the way he used to say that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you keep. I had kept mine. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was simply done pretending that love meant enduring disrespect. Family, I realized, isn't defined by who shares your last name or your address. It's defined by who protects you when you are no longer convenient. The house was still mine, not because of paperwork, not because of ownership, because I never stopped belonging to myself. And that was the ending they never expected. But it was the one I chose.